Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis, the Prayers of Fly podcast. Today is part 8 of the historical blackout and part 2 of Blasting the Historical Blackout, the book review of A.J.P. Taylor's Second World War. So we will begin. Where we left off, a realistic appraisal of Professor Taylor's book, its virtues and its shortcomings. The question now arises as to the soundness and validity of this extraordinary book by Professor Taylor. Professor Trevor Roper states in his attack on the book in July 1961, Encounter, that it is utterly erroneous. I think I would not be especially pretentious if I set down my own appraisal alongside the findings of either Professor Taylor or Professor Trevor Roper on the matter of war responsibility in 1939. If I were to do so, I would unhesitatingly say that Professor Trevor Roper's drastic verdict on Taylor's book, which is utterly erroneous. But I shall not base what I have to say here primarily on my own studies or opinions, but upon repeated readings of the extensive and heavily documented material on 1939 in Professor Tansell's great book, Backdoor to War, and of what will be the definitive book on the causes and outbreak of the Second World War for this generation, and probably for several generations to come. I've already referred to this book, which is about 3 times as long and comprehensive as Professor Taylor's book, and surely rests upon far more than 3 times as much study, both in the documents and in the monographic literature dealing with the subject. Since Professor Taylor knows far more about the origins of the Second World War than Professor Trevor Roper, it is obvious that the manuscript with which I supplement my own personal judgment is incomparably more reliable and conclusive than anything which Trevor Roper could possibly say or write on the subject. The only conclusion which can be drawn from a careful reading of Taylor's book, Tansell's volume, and this monumental new American work, as well as a review of the Taylor volume by the author of the latter, it is that Professor Taylor's account is, so far as it goes, thoroughly sound and dependable, and in accord with the relevant documents on all major items save for British policy in 1939. It is indeed a restrained understatement of the origin of the Second World War. More important, it is an incomplete statement insofar as it fails to provide a realistic and adequate account of the British role in bringing on hostilities in the spring and summer of 1939. It handles the British materials and actions down to July 1939 in admirable fashion. But from that time onward, especially after the British guarantee to Poland on March 31st, 1939, British responsibility is often neglected, obscured, or glossed over, especially the role of Halifax and Kennard, who were as predominant in producing the actual outbreak of the Second World War as was Izvolsky, Sazonov, Pointier, and Berthelot in provoking hostilities in August 1941. This does not necessarily mean that these men in either 1914 or 1939 were villains, but they were responsible for the outbreak of these wars. Their whole war programs may have been colossal blunders in both 1914 and 1939, but they knew what they wanted and got it. Subsequent events have indeed amply proved the leaders of the war party blundered fatally in regard to both wars. Professor Taylor may be quite correct in stating that insofar as the general publics were concerned, the Second World War was one of the most unwanted wars in history. But it was not unwanted by Halifax, Kennard, and the British War Party in the summer of 1939. Chamberlain was rather wavering and schizoid on the matter, but in the end he joined with Halifax and Kennard and stood out against Sir Neville Henderson, who resolutely opposed the war to the last moment. The one other outstanding leader who presumably wanted war in 1939 was Joseph Stalin, since he believed that the anti-communist states would either ruin or weaken themselves to such an extent by the internecine hostilities that they would no longer be an active threat or even any restraint to communism or Russia. Yet Professor Taylor, probably correct in holding that when Stalin signed the pact with Hitler on August 23rd, 1939, he did not feel that it would result in an immediate war between the capitalist states. He had other sufficient immediate aims in signing the pact at the time, pages 262, 263. It is not certain that Joseph Beck, the Polish foreign minister in 1938-39, actually wanted war. But there can be no doubt that he preferred war to even the slightest concessions to the extremely moderate and just demands of Hitler, which were accompanied by far more vital and generous concessions to Poland. Although some of the Polish leaders were fatuous enough to believe that the Polish army was more than a match for the German, Most of them were dominated by a fantastic delusion of future grandeur. They fully expected that Poland would be conquered by Germany, which would then proceed to vanquish Russia. This, however, would be followed by the destruction of Germany by Britain, France, and the United States. Out of the ashes of a war-devastated Central Europe would arise a new, greater Poland, even greater than the old Poland before the first partition of 1772. This would appear to be the only explanation on why Beck preferred inevitable and immediate doom to German proposals that were highly advantageous to Poland. It is well established that no responsible leaders in Germany, France, or Italy wished war in 1939. President Roosevelt apparently desired to have the European war break out as soon as possible, trust Chamberlain to go ahead, and encourage Polish arrogance and stubbornness. But Roosevelt was in no position to exert any directly decisive influence on European decisions in 1939, and Halifax did not need any encouragement from Roosevelt. It is unlikely, however, that Britain would have dared to adopt the policy she did in 1939 in regard to Poland and Germany if Roosevelt had not already promised British leaders all possible American aid in the event of war, and agreed to make every conceivable effort to bring the United States into war on the side of Britain if one broke out. It must be conceded that aside from his errors about the nature, purpose, and the results of the visit of Chamberlain and Halifax to Italy in January 1939, and the defection of Italy from Germany on August 18, 1939, Professor Taylor does provide an amazing amount of material refuting the myth of official British pacifism from Munich down to the background of Chamberlain's Birmingham speech of March 17, 1939, and the initiation of the guarantee to Poland. Nobody could ask for a much better or more fair account of the Munich Conference or the Czechoslovak crisis in March 1939, and he by no means whitewashes British policy in conduct in regard to Poland or Germany in 1939. As Professor Langer and Gleason do Roosevelt with respect to American motives and moves in entering the war in 1941. When all is said and done, it is likely that beginning in the not far distant future, the scholarly chronology of revisionism with respect to the Second World War will be dated and at least figuratively divided or separated into BT and AT, before Taylor and after Taylor. This will be even more the case than it was with BF and AF before Fay and after Fay, in regard to revisionism after the Second World War. Aside from glossing over Britain's what Professor Taylor has omitted or glossed over. Aside from glossing over Britain's major responsibility in encouraging and stiffening the German-Polish dispute, which actually produced the outbreak of the Second World War, Professor Taylor's chief error lies in his handling of the Anglo-Italian situation in 1939, its effect on German-Italian relations, and the impact of both on the coming of the war. The pattern was set by the visit of Chamberlain and Halifax to Rome on January the 11th to 14th, 1939. Professor Taylor's version reads as follows. In January 1939, Chamberlain and Halifax went to Rome. They came empty-handed. Mussolini expected concessions at the expense of France. Instead, he got a high-minded plea from Chamberlain for some assurance that Hitler was not going to go to war. Mussolini thrust out his chin and retaliated with an attack on the British press. The visit to Rome, which was designed as the culmination of Chamberlain's policy, marked instead the end of the Italian illusion. More, though the British did not know this, it pushed Mussolini further onto the German side, page 200. It would be difficult to imagine a statement of the same brevity which contains more errors of fact and interpretation, although the real truth is such that one may be sure that Professor Trevor Roper will not take advantage of this one valid opportunity to question Taylor's material. Actually, Chamberlain and Halifax, or better, Chamberlain under pressure from Halifax, who had by October 1938 seized control over British foreign policy from Chamberlain, came to Rome to try to scare Mussolini out of the Rome-Berlin axis, or at least to frighten him out of agreeing to stick by Hitler in the event of war. Far from seeking to get assurances from Mussolini that Hitler did not contemplate war, they sought to convince Mussolini that Hitler meant to drag Europe into war, and that Britain and France were preparing for the war to resist him. Instead of the reluctant termination of the British policy of peace and goodwill towards Germany, it was the formal beginning of the repudiation of Munich which led to the Second World War. After this decision to make the crucial change in British foreign policy had been decided upon by Halifax weeks previously, when Hitler had done nothing whatever to indicate that he had departed from the Munich Agreement. Of course, he had not even by January the 11th, 1939. Instead of threatening to get further concessions from France, Mussolini promised to try to improve Italian relations with France. Far from pushing Mussolini further onto the German side, the British visit frightened Mussolini out of any intention to stand with Hitler in event of war. Chamberlain and Halifax succeeded in their ominous mission to Italy. Mussolini was alarmed at the implication that the British intended to make war on Germany as soon as they were prepared. And from this time onward, he laid plans to avoid any absolute commitment to stand with Hitler in the event of actual war. In this fateful decision, he was aided by his son-in-law, Count Galeazzo Chinao, the Italian foreign minister, and Bernardo Attilico, the Italian ambassador in Berlin. Their combined timidity and duplicity created the specific situation in late August 1939, which permitted hostilities. This story is too long and complicated to be told here, but the essentials are as follows. The French, especially Georges Bonnet, the French minister, ardently desired to keep out of the war in 1939, and we know that Bonnet would have been able to do so if he could have faced his colleagues in Halifax with a firm Italian promise to stand by Germany in the event of war. But Chinao, with Mussolini's approval, wavered and welched, and during the final crisis, Attilico made a special trip from Berlin to Rome to strengthen Chinao's stand and urged Mussolini to refuse the promise to line up with Hitler in the event that hostilities broke out. He brought back to Berlin the utterly impossible demands that Mussolini deliberately stipulated as the price of his participation in the war. The Italians were not even clever enough to bluff and at least promise to stick by Hitler, although they might not have intended to do so. A forthright Italian bluff was all that Bonnet needed. But Chinao stupidly told the British ambassador in Rome privately on August 18, 1939, that Italy would not go to war along with Germany. The crucial news was passed on quickly to Halifax, who eagerly used it to undermine Bonnet's stand. Bonnet had also been weakened by some unjustified bragging by General Gamelin as to the military prowess of the French army. Actually, Gamelin, like Bonnet, was opposed to war. He did not wish to assume the responsibility for the rejection of the Halifax war policy. He had declared at the French Defense Council meeting on March 13, 1939, that France was not prepared for war. The only conceivable excuse for his different interpretation at the August 23, 1939 Defense Council meeting was that Italy, in the meantime, had deserted Germany. No action between Munich and the outbreak of war paid off better in assuring the success of Halifax's war plan than the visit to Rome in January 1939. Mussolini immediately passed on to Hitler the news of the bellicose change in British policy towards Germany, but apparently even this was not enough to convince Hitler that Britain would make war in any final showdown. Not even this January news, nor the British guarantee to Poland at the end of March, served to convince him of these actual British plans. The British guarantee of Poland on March 31st, 1939, did not have the slightest moral or political justification. Hitler had been more friendly to Britain than had Poland. His plans for a reasonable understanding with Poland were well known to Halifax. They had even been discussed with Halifax when he visited Hitler at the Berchtesgaden on November 19th, 1937, and were implicitly approved by him. See Taylor, pages 137, 138. The restraint in Hitler's original proposals to Poland in October 1938 became known to the British government very quickly. They recognized that they were far short of what many responsible British statesmen and publicists had recommended, and Hitler's demand on Poland carried with them offers and assurances to Poland that were the Weimar Republic would never countenance. Professor Taylor has made it clear that Hitler was not responsible for the disintegration of Czechoslovakia and the setting up of a protectorate over Bohemia, and that Britain very casually repudiated a guarantee to Czechoslovakia. The breakup of Czechoslovakia provided no factual or logical basis for any British rapprochement with Poland. Poland was selected by Halifax and the British War Group because it was known by the autumn of 1938 that Germany was making an effort to bring about a final peaceful adjustment with Poland, and that Poland was almost certain to reject the German proposals, especially if Britain and France did nothing to curb Polish arrogance and stubbornness and to urge upon Poland sincere negotiations with Germany to reach a peaceful settlement. Hence, Poland was an ideal choice if the provocation of war was the goal of British foreign policy by the outset of the year 1939. The public announcements of the final shift of British policy to hostility to Germany and to grant a blank check to Poland, which was forecast in Chamberlain's Birmingham speech of March 17, 1939, rested on a twofold fraud. One, the charge that Germany was preparing for widespread military aggression, indeed world conquest, and two, a hoax concocted through Virgil Tilia, the Romanian minister to London. As noted earlier, Taylor makes it crystal clear that German policy in regard to Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1938, 1939, in no way involved or envisioned aggressive military action. Even more nonsensical was the charge made by leaders of the British War Party that Hitler's occupation of Prague was proof of a program of world conquest. Tila was induced, some allege that he was directly or indirectly bribed, but in any event, he was persuaded and coached by the British Foreign Office, namely by Vansittart, to draw up a false statement charging Germany with seeking to seize the Romanian economy and announce that Hitler had just presented an ultimatum to Romania along these lines. This fraudulent subterfuge was sadly needed since the alleged British official indignation about Prague was so palpably mendacious that it was only useful to incite the most ignorant and credulous sectors of the British public. The Romanian Foreign Minister, Grigore Galfencu, immediately repudiated Tila's statement, revealed its falsity, and rebuked Tila. He would have recalled him had he not feared offending the British, but the British Foreign Office paid no attention whatever to Galfencu's repudiation and continued to use the Tila fraud as if it were gospel truth. Taylor mentions the Tila fabrication and admits its falsity, but does not point out the role of the British Foreign Office in arranging for it or timing it to fit with Chamberlain's Birmingham speech, pages 206-207. Any such rash and unprovoked act as granting a blank check to Poland was almost without precedent in the history of rational British diplomacy. Assuming that Britain wished peace, it was a type of action more in accord with the decisions which would have been made by someone like King John, Richard III, Titus Oates, Queen Anne, or George IV. The Kaiser was bitterly criticized for granting a blank check to Austria in July 1914, and it was a mistake. But in 1914, there was a very substantial provocation for it. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne had been assassinated by Serbian underworld characters with advanced knowledge, if not the connivance of the Serbian cabinet, which had done nothing to frustrate the plot. Germany under Hitler had been more friendly to Britain than Poland, and would have been a far more powerful ally. Nothing in known German policy in the spring of 1939 offered any threat whatever to Britain. Moreover, the guarantee to Poland, either when made on March 31st, 1939, or when confirmed on August 25th, was a hypocritical fraud, which did not offer any honest or comprehensive protection to Poland and was not intended to do so. It merely encouraged Poland to stand firm against reasonable German demands and thus make inevitable a war against Germany. It was Hitler who offered the real guarantee to Poland. When in autumn of 1939, Russia brazenly occupied eastern Poland, the question was raised in the House of Commons as to whether the guarantee of Poland covered aggression against her by Russia. Richard A. Butler, who answered for the government, had to admit that it did not. It was only a guarantee against Germany, which at the outset did not contemplate annexing any Polish territory. Rather, Germany offered to guarantee the Versailles boundaries of Poland. The British guarantee to Poland was therefore a gratuitous and unprovoked act in harmony with the British policy to bring about war, which in Churchill's terms would smash Germany, or, in those of Halifax and Duff Cooper, would preserve the balance of power on the continent. The hostile attitude of Churchill was well expressed in a statement made to the distinguished American military administrator and industrialist General Robert E. Wood as early as November 1936. Germany is getting too strong and we must smash her. This accorded with the sentiments of Churchill's great and good friend and his chief unofficial contact in the United States, Bernard M. Baruch. The latter observed to General George C. Marshall in 1938, "We are going to lick that fellow Hitler. He isn't going to get away with it." Halifax and the British War Group also handled the situation in the summer of 1939 very cleverly in its psychological aspects. The wild enthusiasm of the British and French publics at the return of Chamberlain and Daladier from Munich at the end of September 1938 had demonstrated the tremendous extent and potency of the desire of the British and French peoples for peace. It was necessary to prevent this peace sentiment from being revived a year later when the German-Polish-British impasse would threaten war. A great public demonstration in behalf of peace in the late summer of 1939, especially when there was no real cause for war, might have frustrated the bellicose plans of Halifax and his associates. Hence the guarantee to Poland. In late March and early April 1939 was kept secret and given little attention in the newspapers. Poland, with British approval, had discontinued its negotiations with Germany on March the 26th, 1939, and no hint was given by the British government of any impending crisis. In this, Halifax and his group were unwittingly aided by Hitler, who kept very quiet on foreign affairs from May to August 1939. The British public was thus lulled into a false sense of peace and security all through the summer of 1939. There was no such alarm or fear of war as there had been in the previous summer. Hence, there was no opportunity or apparent reason for mobilizing the powerful but then dormant peace sentiment of Britain. The country was taken entirely by surprise and suddenly thrown into a war which ultimately reduced it to a third-class power and protracted austerity almost without warning, with no understanding whatever of the actual reasons for the bellicose action. Both Chamberlain and Halifax falsified their reports of Hitler's favorable reaction to a proposed international conference on September the 2nd, which might still have both stopped the German-Polish War and prevented the European War. It would, of course, be absurd to load all the blame for the British refusal to accept the Munich gains and opportunities in the decision on a policy of hostility and war against Germany on Halifax's shoulders. He was aided and abetted, perhaps influenced to adopt this policy by the British leaders who attacked Chamberlain and the Munich settlement. They were an impressive group, of which the following are only representative. From the conservative side, there were Churchill, Duff Cooper, Leopold Amory, Anthony Eden, Harold Nicholson, Duncan Sandys, Harold Macmillan, Roger Keyes, Sidney Herbert, General Spears, Lord Carborne, and Lord Wolmer. From the Labour group, Attlee, Ernest Bevin, Harold Lasky fully matched the Conservatives in their bitter invective against Chamberlain and Munich. Nevertheless, Halifax, as Foreign Secretary, was the responsible leader of the war group, and he carried through the war program in a ruthless and undeviating manner and with consummate skill and determination from mid-October 1938 to the sending of the final ultimatum to Germany on September 3rd, 1939. If there was any villainy in 1939, it was Lord Halifax, far more so than Churchill. The latter had been little to do with British diplomacy at the time and actually did not know much about what was going on at the end of August when Halifax was craftily and skillfully piloting England and Europe into war. While affecting a personal piety almost akin to that of Thomas à Kempis, Halifax planned, engineered, and gratuitously let loose on the world the most cruel and devastating war in history, the ultimate result of which may be the extermination of the human race, with no more justification than the perpetration of an obsolete British political tradition fashioned in the 16th century. Just why Halifax made the shift and took over the leadership of the war program in the group is not certain, but one thing is obvious, namely that it was no trivial or spontaneous affair such as Professor Taylor suggests, page 205. Perhaps Halifax heard the call of conscience in the watches of the night. It was far more deliberate and long planned than this implies, and surely was not dictated by conscientious scruples. As to when Halifax succeeded Chamberlain in the control of the British foreign policy, one may say that it certainly dated from October the 6th, 1938. Even Taylor indicates that he had begun to break with Chamberlain before Munich as early as September the 23rd, page 108. 180. Kennard, to be sure, exerted no dominant influence over British foreign policy in general from October 1938 to September 1939, but as ambassador to Poland, he played a leading role in late August 1939 in bringing on hostilities through his vigorous pressure on Beck and the Poles not to negotiate with Germany. As to the motives of the group which backed up Halifax, they were both varied and numerous. Some were chronic German haters. Others were alarmed by Germany's economic recovery and the methods whereby this had been accomplished. Some may have honestly feared that Hitler did have a program of extensive military conquest, although surely none of them believed that this would be directed against Britain. Some, like Churchill, believed that they might improve their political status in the event of war. Whatever the lesser deviations and the differences of the conservatives on this matter, they were all united in the fear that the German growth and renewed power would upset the balance of power on the continent. And they believed that a war to crush Germany was preferable to this. They did not realize that this conflict would result in the permanent destruction of any balance of power, in which the dominant role would be played by an inveterate enemy of Britain rather than a would-be ally. The supporters of the war party from the left were opposed to Hitler's ideology, his destruction of German democracy, his dictatorial methods, his treatment of the Jews, and the wiping out of the traditional German labor unions. To summarize the matter of war responsibility in 1939, one might quite safely say that Professor Taylor is entirely correct in holding that the broad general responsibility, running over 2 decades, was divided among all the parties and was the outcome of blunders by all of them. In regard to the direct and immediate responsibility for the outbreak of hostilities in September 1939, the blame for the German-Polish War was divided between Poland, Britain, and Germany, with the so-called guilt ranking in this order. The primary and direct responsibility for the European War, which grew into the Second World War, was almost solely that of Great Britain and the British War Group, made up both of conservatives and Labourites. If Britain had not gratuitously given Poland a blank check, which was not needed in the slightest to assure British security, Poland might have risked a war with Germany. Nevertheless, in this case, there would still have been no justification for British intervention in such a war or for the provocation of the European War. The sole British responsibility for the outbreak of the European War in September 1939 stands out in contrast to the immediate responsibility for starting a European War in August 1914, which was divided between Russia and France in the order given. If Alexander Izvolsky, the Russian ambassador to France in 1914, was more responsible than any other individual for war in 1914, so was Lord Halifax more to be blamed than any other person for the coming of war in 1939. Looking at the matter realistically, it is probably for the best that Professor Taylor did not tell in his book all the truth about the onset of the war, especially the primary role of Halifax and Kennard in bringing it on in late August 1939. The shock of what he had actually told has been staggering. Aside from the writings of Air Marshal Harris, C.P. Snow, and Secretary J.M. Sprite on the British responsibility for the saturation bombing, the works of military historians such as General J.F.C. Fuller and Captain B.H. Liddell Hart, the revelation from J.P. Veal and Montgomery Belgian on the Nuremberg trials, Victor Golanska's courageous book on the barbarous treatment of Germany after the war, and some parts of the official history of the war. Virtually no truth has been told in England on the Second World War since 1939. No public, even the British public, could stand too large a dose of truth all in one batch. A complete account of the origins of the Second World War could not have been digested or accepted all at one time. Even Professor Taylor's personal safety might have been placed in jeopardy. In the opinion of this writer, his book is almost ideal as the first volume to break through the historical blackout on this fundamental question of war origins. It is concise, clear, readable, and convincing with respect to the great mass of revelations it does set down, and as such, it has both rendered the greatest service of any historical work published since September 1939, and constitutes perhaps the most impressive example of personal courage of any historical work of this generation. As was hinted earlier, and should be repeated and emphasized here, far the most important result of the publication of Professor Taylor's book is its inevitable and vastly beneficial effect in undermining the historical blackout in the Western world and making it much more difficult in the future to discredit offhand, serious, and substantial books which seek to divulge the truth about the responsibility for the Second World War and related topics. Professor Taylor's wide fame and vast prestige, and his long record as a consistent Germanophobe and Hitler hater, which he has reaffirmed since his book was published, has now made it impossible to deride and denigrate, even summarily to laugh out of court, any book which approaches 1939 in a realistic manner, no matter how learned and scholarly. Even the forthcoming magisterial volume on 1939, to which I have made frequent reference, would have met just this fate because the author does not happen to be a person of extensive international reputation or one known to be a chronic Germanophobe. That it will be bitterly attacked even now, there is no doubt, but after the appearance of the Taylor book, those criticisms which were not based on careful, factual analysis will prove redounding duds. Any statement of truth about 1939 can no longer be disposed of casually as demonstrated as a demonstration of mental defect, moral perversity or original sin. Cleo never had a more striking and salutary rendezvous with destiny. To use the words put into President Roosevelt's mouth by his speechwriters in 1936, than in the case of the writing and publication of Professor Taylor's memorable volume, it may even entice her away from her far too prolonged rendezvous with the Gadarenes for more than 2 decades. The significance of Professor Taylor's book for citizens of the United States. It may be worthwhile here to indicate briefly the significance of the book by Professor Taylor for citizens of the United States. So far as revisionist scholarship is concerned, this is greatly strengthened and its basic contentions are confirmed. As just made clear, it will now be possible to treat the causes of the Second World War realistically and honestly without being accused of defect or moral depravity. The awe and reverence with which English historians are customarily regarded by the American Historical Guild will make it more difficult and embarrassing for the latter to laugh off Professor Taylor's confirmation of the basic tenets of American revisionist historical scholarship. The book undermines the accuracy of American anti-interventionism, the book underlines the accuracy of American anti-interventionism, which had been supported by revisionist historical writings in this country. The interventionists based their policy on the assumption that the United States was in mortal danger of infiltration and attack by Nazi Germany. Professor Taylor's book further emphasizes the grotesque fallacy of this contention. Hitler did not even wish to attack England or France, to say nothing of proceeding westward across the Atlantic. Nor was it necessary for the United States to enter the war to protect Britain or France. Hitler sought peace after the Polish War and after the fall of France and Dunkirk. Had he obtained it, his only plan was to turn eastward. In the light of the facts brought forward by Professor Taylor, which are not at all new to American revisionist historians, and had previously been well stated by Professor Tansel and others, President Roosevelt's allegation that Hitler planned to invade the United States by way of Dakar, Rio de Janeiro, and Panama, his notorious timetable for Nazi occupation of Iowa, is shown to be as fantastic and untenable as the statement that he was surprised by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. A realistic approach to American foreign policy from 1937 to 1931 thus receives impressive indirect support from a courageous British historical scholar. American entry into the war, whatever the various pressures of many groups for intervention, was overwhelmingly the plan and program of President Roosevelt himself, who turned from isolation to armament, intervention, and war in order to produce the economic recovery which the New Deal had failed to bring about. To achieve a third term and to enjoy the glory and prestige of being a war president, no informed person can any longer support with a straight face the assumption that he was motivated primarily by fear of the Nazi rattlesnakes, or a sense of urgent need to protect the United States from invasion, either in the 1940s or in any predictable period. Whether taking this country into war made the United States safer can be most rationally assessed by reading the daily papers of our time. Although it would be grossly unfair to accuse President Roosevelt of being knowingly and deliberately under the influence of communist pressure in preparing for war, communist influence here was very powerful. The vigorous labor support of his war policy was based primarily on the communist-inspired Popular Front, internationalist ideology, which had been effectively propounded by Litvinov in Geneva. Roosevelt was surrounded with communist sympathizers, and some undoubted communists, one a member of his official family at the White House, who exerted a powerful influence on Roosevelt in Secretary Hull. Hull's ultimatum on November the 26th, 1941, which brought on the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, was based in large part directly upon a memorandum handed to him by Harry Dexter White, surely a communist agent, if not a card-carrying communist himself. One myth that should be debunked is that Roosevelt was pushed into war by American Jews. Although some of the latter, such as Samuel Untermeyer, may have declared war on Hitler as early as 1933, Roosevelt did not need any pressure from the Jews to create his interventionism and war policy. There is little evidence that he was deeply disturbed by Hitler's anti-Jewish policy. He was much more annoyed by the fact that Hitler's New Deal had succeeded in a spectacular fashion while his own had failed to bring prosperity to the United States. Roosevelt's angry outburst when he learned that Governor Lehman of New York had come out against the Supreme Court plan in 1937, in his statement at Yalta in 1945 that he would like to give the American Jews to Ibn Saud, afford ample proof that the Jews could not be saddled with responsibility for Roosevelt's foreign policy from 1937 to Pearl Harbor. The Taylor book could not have appeared at a better time in the United States as an instrument of historical sanitation. There was never a time when historical garbage collection paid off so handsomely. Although its procurers and vendors may be encouraged by their very success to overplay their hands, scattered through nearly 1,200 pages, W.L. Schreier's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich treats tens of thousands of American readers to such obsolete duds and legends as the allegation that the Nazis burned the Reichstag building, although a year before the book went to the printer, careful historical research had proved that they had no more to do with it than with the singing of the Maine. The whole frame of reference and leitmotif of the Schreier book revolves around fundamental assumption which Taylor has fully and authoritatively refuted. It is doubtful if a more extensive anthology of errors concerning the personality and policies of Hitler and the causes and the responsibilities for the Second World War has ever been assembled even in wartime. what may fairly be regarded as the children's edition of the Schreier book, Hitler and Nazism, by Professor Louis L. Snyder of the College of the City of New York, apparently proceeds on the premise for which there is considerable justification. The American public has already been as thoroughly brainwashed in regard to Germany in the 1930s as any defecting American soldier was brainwashed during the Korean War period by its Chinese captors and mentors. It is worthy of note that this recent tidal wave of hate Germany literature has been tied very closely with the effort of the communists to stir American antagonism against West Germany. It has been perfectly timed to support the communist program. Walter Lippmann has repeatedly emphasized the fact that neither Southeast Asia, Africa, nor Latin America even begins to concern Khrushchev as much as the increasing prosperity and reviving military power of West Germany. Hence, it is unfair, as so many do, to attribute this flood of smear literature against Germany wholly to Jews and Jewish pressure. If this were true, inundation would have come 10 or 15 years ago, when the memories of Nazi persecution of the Jews were much closer and fresher. The Taylor book could also nip in the bud the plans of the ambitious lawyer O. John Rogge to retry in book form. The official German report his ill-fated sedition trial, free from the embarrassment of having Lawrence Dennis rise to his feet every few minutes to make Rogge look ridiculous. He presumes, which he can do safely, that no one in 10,000 of his readers will know that his methods were devastatingly exposed and refuted by Dennis and Maximilian St. George in their book, A Trial on Trial, way back in 1946. When the security campaign headed against radicals with the coming of the Cold War, and the left-wingers got a dose of something like the same treatment that Rogge applied to conservative American anti-interventionists in 1934 to 1945, he shrieked to high heaven about the invasion of American civil liberties. Indeed, if the hatred of Russia and communism should ever reach the fever height the hatred of Germany had attained in 1943 to 1944, Rogge might be in grave danger of having his very tactics of those days applied to him. He proceeded in the sedition trial on the principle of guilt by association. Both the German government of that time and the American anti-interventionists were Rogge persecuted for sedition, favored keeping the United States out of the Second World War. Hence, Rogge charged the anti-interventionist defendants with deliberately and seditiously serving the German cause. Today, both Rogge and Soviet Russian communists aim to stir up hatred of Germany, now our indispensable ally. Under sufficient pressure of hostility to Russia and communism, the formula of guilt by association can logically be revived and applied to Rogge. Were Nazi war crimes more extensive and brutal than those of the Allies? Already, there have arisen a line of criticism designed to discredit the significance of Professor Taylor's book, even granting its accuracy as to general responsibility for war in 1939. It held that, although Hitler and the Nazis may not have started the war in 1939, or even wished to start it, the brutal outrages of which they were guilty after the war got started proved them such degenerate gangsters that Halifax and his associates were justified in resorting to any degree of plotting and duplicity required to produce a war to smash and annihilate them, and that President Roosevelt performed a great moral service in allying the United States into the war, to make it certain that the salutary and needed act of extermination will be accomplished. Any such argument is even more fallacious and deplorable than the ex post facto jurisprudence on which the Nuremberg trials were founded. Further, there is no reason whether to believe that any such brutal wartime actions have been alleged against Germany would have taken place if peace had been preserved. Finally, as Milton Meyer, Victor Gollancz, and others have already suggested, it seemed likely that the whole question of the alleged war crimes of Germany, will ultimately be submitted to as drastic a type of revisionism as the conventional views about the responsibility for the Second World War have been subjected by Professor Taylor. It may also be observed that the question of brutalities and atrocities associated with the Second World War is rather a dangerous topic for either side to examine too thoroughly or to overemphasize. Only those committed by the Germans have been subject to searching investigation and given worldwide publicity. Even assuming that all the charges ever made against the Nazis by anybody of reasonable sanity and responsibility are true, the Allies do not come off much, if any, better. There were the millions killed by the saturation bombing of civilians, which the official British authorities have long since admitted was launched by the British, who rejected the repeated proposals of Hitler to ban this form of barbarism. Now, C.P. Snow, in his Harvard lecture on science and government, has revealed the fact that the British Air Force was, with full approval of the British government, followed the Lindemann plan of concentrating not on military objectives, but upon closely crowded homes of the German and Italian working people, on the ruthless assumption that this would cause the greatest possible number of civilian casualties per bomb. Up until the atom bombing of the Japanese cities and the bombings in the Korean War, no horrors in war exceeded the incendiary bombing of German cities, such as Hamburg. No single isolated act proved against the Nazi matches for wanton brutality the bombing and destruction of the beautiful city of Dresden, which had no military significance whatever. Then there was the wholesale butchery of Polish officers and leaders by Stalin in the Kaizen Forest and elsewhere, the Russian extermination and expulsion of the Baltic countries, which some observers regard as worse than the Kaizen episode, and the massacre or enslavement of an estimated 5 million Russian soldiers and other anti-communist refugees who were rolled up and turned back to Stalin by the Allies after the war. The slave labor camps maintained by Stalin contained many more persons than the German concentration camps, and their treatment was far more cruel and brutal. No reliable statistics have been available as to the morality in them, but it certainly greatly exceeded that of the German camps. There is little in the history of mankind more horrible than the sufferings of the Germans. Expelled from the eastern provinces, the Sudeten area, and other regions, some 4 to 6 million perished from butchery, starvation, exposure, and disease in the process. Their sufferings were obviously far more hideous and prolonged than those of the Jews said to have been exterminated in great numbers by the Nazis. The tragedy at Lidice was reenacted by the Czechs hundreds of times at the expense of Sudeten Germans during this expulsion. The Morgenthau Plan, which was inspired by Stalin and his associates and passed on to Henry Morgenthau by Harry Dexter White and other Soviet sympathizers, envisioned the starvation of between 20 and 30 million Germans in the process of turning Germany into a purely agricultural pastoral nation. In a slightly revised form as JCS 1067, it was actually applied for several years in occupied Germany. While it may not have produced as many deaths, it certainly brought about more actual suffering than such Nazi extermination of the Jews as took place. From the standpoint of public morality, at least, if there was to be an Eichmann trial, there should have been a Morgenthau trial. Indeed, if one were to accept Nuremberg jurist concepts and practices, there was even a sound basis for a Morgenthau trial. Extremely severe sentences were imposed on Germans convicted at Nuremberg for plotting evil deeds. And it is doubtful if anything more evil than the Morgenthau Plan was ever plotted. Even the American officials who executed JCS 1067 would not be immune from trial and punishment if Nuremberg precedents were applied to their cases. Prompting aggressive war was an essentially heinous crime at Nuremberg and one which figured prominently in the trials. If, however, one can believe the documents, no prominent Nazi leaders, nor all of them combined, were as busy plotting aggressive war in 1939 as were Morgenthau and Harry Dexter White during the year 1941. The Allied treatment of German SS prisoners of war matched, if it did not exceed, any of the brutalities of German concentration camps. And in this case, there was no excuse of lack of food, clothing, drugs, or medical care. No record has been kept of the multitude of Germans who perished as a result of executions, proposed malnutrition, and disease during the period immediately after the war, when they were limited for a considerable period to rations not over half those given to the inmates of Auschwitz prior to the final collapse of German power in the East. Virtually the entire Japanese population of the American Pacific coast were dragged out of their homes and herded into concentration camps without the slightest need from the standpoint of national security. After they returned, there was never any complete restoration of property. While few were killed in the process, and they were relatively well fed, it was a humiliating and arbitrary act which few fair-minded American citizens will remember with pride or good conscience. Finally, there was the atom bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some 7 months after the Japanese had been trying to surrender on the same terms, finally accepted in August 1945. Terms submitted in January 1945 to President Roosevelt through General MacArthur, who vainly urged Roosevelt to consider them. This utterly needless bombing has been described by no less an authority than General J.F.C. Fuller as something which would have disgraced Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. A colorful summary of what went on was provided by Edgar L. Jones, a highly literate American veteran of the Second World War, in an article entitled "One War is Enough" in the Distinguished Atlantic Monthly, February 1946. What kind of a war do civilians suppose we fought anyway? We shot prisoners in cold blood, wiped down hospitals and strafed lifeboats, killed or mistreated enemy civilians, finished off enemy wounded, tossed the dying into a hole with the dead, and in the Pacific boiled the flesh off enemy skulls to make table ornaments for sweethearts to carve their bones into letter openers. We topped off our saturation bombing and burning of enemy civilians by dropping atomic bombs on nearly 2 defenseless cities, thereby setting an all-time record for instantaneous mass slaughter. 2 great wrongs do not make a right, but even a casual survey of Allied atrocities, which does not even include those in the Asiatic area, aside from the atomic bombings or tortures of German prisoners in Malmedy and Nuremberg trials, make it amply clear that there is no validity to the argument that the Second World War had to be waged to rid the world of a totally unique gang of German scoundrels. Unique both as to moral depravity and the deeds of brutal violence. Hitler's evil deeds have been told and retold, beginning long before 1939. After the Cold War started, the Western world began to learn something about the monstrous and nefarious doings of Stalin. That man of massive outstanding personality and deep and cool wisdom, as Churchill describes him, which far exceed those of Hitler. But we have heard little of the horrors which were due to the acts and policies of Churchill and Roosevelt, such as the saturation bombing of civilians, the atom bombings of the Japanese cities, planned by Roosevelt, the expulsion of about 15 million Germans from their former homes and death of 4 to 6 million in the process, and the cruel and barbarous treatment of Germany from 1945 to 1948. The greatest horror that could fairly be traced to their doings is still held in reserve for us: the nuclear extermination of mankind. Professor Taylor logically and wisely deals only slightly and incidentally with the domestic policy of Nazi Germany, although he does hint correctly several times that this is probably did more to produce the war than Hitler's foreign policy. Of all Hitler's domestic policies, the one which brought upon him the most greatest opprobrium and hatred, and the only one which played an important public role in encouraging war on Germany, was his treatment of the German Jews. A piece of folly which I have condemned for nearly 30 years in numerous articles, books, and lectures. Indeed, the famous American rabbi Stephen S. Wise reprinted a series of articles I wrote for the Scripps Howard's newspaper criticizing Hitler's anti-Semitism and distributing thousands of copies. There could, however, be no greater paradox in history than a war in behalf of Poland on the basis of the Jewish issue. There were in Poland in 1933 6 times as many Jews as in Germany, and they were surely treated as badly as when the German Jews were under Hitler. Moreover, by 1939, Hitler's anti-Jewish program had moderated, and more than half of the German Jews had left Germany, whereas the Polish Jewish population had declined relatively slightly, and their treatment has not improved to any notable extent. In the 1930s, when I was actively engaged in journalism, I received much praise from Jewish leaders for my columns and editorials criticizing Hitler's treatment of the Jews, but this was interspersed with a frequent and insistent suggestion that I should not overlook the far more extensive plight of the Jews in Poland. Several of my more responsible correspondents on this theme charged that the Polish government was laying plans to exterminate the Polish Jews as communist revolutionaries. This was several years before it is even alleged that Hitler started his extermination project. The unnecessary war. Will there be another and final one? Whatever quarrels one may have with the details of Professor Taylor's interpretations, he may surely agree with his basic contention that the Second World War was an unnecessary war. This fact has been admirably summarized by the author of the forthcoming monumental work on 1939, to which I have already made reference. A definite and hopeful trend towards a new arrangement of European relations based on a peaceful revision of the Versailles settlement was rudely interrupted and permanently frustrated by the unexpected outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939. Germany had regained her rightful position as the dominant power in Central Europe in 1938, and at that time it seemed only a question of months before she would succeed in establishing relations with all her immediate neighbors on a solid and dependable basis. Germany had become prosperous by 1938, and there were numerous indications that France, Great Britain, and Italy were recovering from the world depression which had begun in 1929. There were also hopeful indications that the leaders of France had become fully aware of the new realities and were prepared to abandon their old policies of active intervention in Central Europe. This meant that the last obstacles to a workable Franco-German amity could be removed because there were no longer any territorial problems or disputes between the two countries. Italy had gracefully accepted the reunion of Austria with Germany, and there was no longer any clouds on the horizon of German-Italian relations. German-Polish relations had exhibited general improvement for several years. and Hitler's moderate and responsible attitude towards Poland was highly auspicious for the prospect of a successful cooperation between the two countries in the future. There was also a friendly attitude between Germany and Hungary, and there was increasing friendliness and confidence in the contacts between Germany and such Balkan nations as Romania and Yugoslavia. The Soviet Union had been excluded from the deliberations of the Munich Conference in September 1938, and there was every indication that the communist colossus would remain isolated behind the cordon sanitaire established shortly after the First World War. Hitler's friendly attitudes toward the British Empire was an almost notorious fact, and it was evident that Germany had no intention of seeking to resume her formal rivalry with Great Britain and naval and colonial ambitions. British world trade was increasing along with German prosperity. Hence, there was no reason to expect that new economic tensions of any serious nature would arise between these formal principal rivals for world trade. All this should have meant the institution of a new era of peaceful development for Europe. Instead, in the following year, Western Europe began to suffer the horrors, decline, and eclipse which accompanied the Second World War. Although another important and very timely lesson, which may well be drawn from Professor Taylor's book, is that democracy by itself alone is no safeguard whatever against war. A fundamental consideration set forth with much force and learning by the American historian and expert on international relations, Professor George Hubbard Bulkley, at the end of the First World War. In submitting the manuscripts of the impressive work on 1939, which I have mentioned above, to one of the most prominent political scientists in the United States for critical examination, his main practical observation as to its import for today was the following. The longer one reads the book, the more interesting and absorbing it becomes. But I could hardly resist a feeling of discouragement after I'd finished it, because it reveals so forcefully how a handful of leaders can put democratic nations into war, and in fact, by manipulating public opinion, change otherwise peaceful, just, and humane peoples into irrational and belligerent individuals with intense hatred for other peoples hundreds of or thousands of miles distant from them, who have done them no harm. It is almost enough to cause one to lose faith in the democratic process, but I suppose we have to believe in democracy in spite of the way it works at times, rather than because of the way it works. If people can learn by experience, this book should help prevent the repetition of two previous world wars of this century. This sagacious observation applies equally well to Professor Taylor's work, and should serve as a warning that a third world war will not be prevented by merely mouthing arrogant platitudes or benign homilies about the virtues and superiorities of democracy in the free world. These semantic gestures must be supplemented and implemented by all the wisdom, precaution, foresight, and statecraft that can be drawn from the disastrous experience with two world wars and their ominous aftermaths. Failing this, we shall not have another opportunity. We are not likely to succeed so long as we resolutely reject searching self-exhaustion, but continue to seek a scapegoat on whom we may lay the blame for all international tragedies. The effect to make a scapegoat out of the Kaiser in Germany after the First World War produced the Versailles Treaty, and in time, the Second World War. The same process was continued on a more fantastic scale after the Second World War, and it has already led us to the brink of nuclear war several times. Most menacingly as these lines are being written, Professor Taylor has made clear the folly in seeking to make Hitler's foreign policy the cause of all the miseries and anguish of the world since 1939 or even 1933. We can get no valid comfort from the illusion that nuclear warfare will be withheld in the Third World War as poison gas was in the Second. As F.J.P. Veal pointed out so well in his Advance to Barbarism, the Nuremberg trials took care of that. They show that the rule in the future will be that defeated leaders, military and civilian, will be executed. Hence, no leader in wartime will spare any effective horrors which may avert defeat. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery got this point when he stated in Paris, June 9, 1948, "The Nuremberg trials have been made the waging of unsuccessful war a crime. The generals on the defeated side are tried and then hanged." As cartoonist Clarence D. Batchelor sardonically observed, during the latter part of the 20th century, the prevailing mode in post-war neckties will be durable hemp or nylon. They will be de rigueur among losing leaders. Dr. A. J.P. Taylor and the Origins of the Second World War, an English report by Frederick J.P. Veal, author of Advance to Barbarism, War Crimes Discreetly Veiled. The conclusions reached by Dr. A.J.P. Taylor in his recently published book, The Origins of the Second World War, were naturally received with surprise and gratification by the German public. They had long been convinced by intensive propaganda that had been judiciously proved beyond any shadow of doubt at the Nuremberg trials that the Second World War was the outcome of an attempt by a megalomaniac named Adolf Hitler to conquer the world. If the subject was indeed res judica, it seems strange that Dr. Taylor or anyone else should find anything in the subject to investigate. Dr. Taylor's conclusions are summarized in the following passage from his book. The War of 1939, far from being premeditated, was a mistake. The result on both sides of diplomatic blunders, this is a story without heroes, perhaps even without villains. It was a war less wanted by nearly everybody than almost any war in history. In retrospect, though many were guilty, none was innocent. The British public also brought up to believe that the judgment delivered at the Nuremberg trials had made the subject res judica was equally surprised. In view of Dr. Taylor's reputation as violently anti-German leftist, his conclusions were received in Britain with widespread dismay, especially as that they could not be silenced or suppressed. Owing to his oft-stated strong anti-German views, Taylor had been a welcome contributor to newspapers, controlled by the now fanatically anti-German press baron Lord Beaverbrook. It was thus impossible to deal with Taylor's book by the usual procedure adopted in the case of books written by unknown authors, expressing unwelcome views, named by rigorously boycotting all mention of them in the press. The silent treatment. In fact, possibly because the implications of this book were not realized by the editor, it was given special publicity by being serialized in Lord Beaverbrook's Evening Standard. The consequences which would follow general acceptance of Dr. Taylor's conclusions did not escape the notice of Professor Hugh Trevor Roper, a leading exponent of orthodox views, who probably published a strongly worded article in Encounter condemning Dr. Taylor for being so irresponsible as to cast doubt upon a sanctified belief which was one of the greatest practical importance to contemporary British foreign policy. The combined outcome of Dr. Taylor's book and Professor Trevor Roper's article was that a discussion between the two Oxford University historians was arranged to take place on the BBC television. This discussion was duly broadcast on the 9th of July, 1961. It should be stressed at the outset that the point at issue was no mere academic problem of interest only to scholars, such as what were the intentions of Hannibal when he laid siege to Saguntum? Did Hannibal intend merely to round off the Carthaginian possessions in Spain, or did he intend to provoke a war with Rome? Upon the point at issue discussed on the BBC television on the 9th of July, British foreign policy will be based during the next few years. If, as Professor Trevor Roper maintained, the Second World War was the outcome of the crazy ambition of the megalomaniac Hitler to conquer the world, Great Britain, France, and Poland were merely defending themselves from a possibly mortal and unprovoked attack. In such circumstances, they were clearly justified in using any means for their self-protection. Seen in this light, even some excuse can be found for Professor F.A. Lindemann's plan to conduct terror bombing against the German civilian population. Bombing particularly directed against working-class dwellings because a higher percentage of bloodshed could be attained per ton of bombs dropped by attacking these densely populated residential areas. Self-preservation justified any measure, however intrinsically barbarous. Not only does acceptance of the view of the origin of the Second World War propounded by Professor Trevor Roper justify any act committed by Germany's opponents, but it also renders every act committed by Germany after the outbreak of war a culpable effort to promote and achieve the criminal intentions of Hitler. No doubt it was with this assumption in the back of his mind that Air Marshal Sir John Slessor wrote to the Sunday Times on the 9th of July, 1961. Public opinion among our allies regards the acquisition by the Poles of the territories beyond the Oder and Neisse line as only reasonable compensation for the terrible wrongs they suffered at the hands of Hitler's Germany. The Air Marshal's argument only makes sense if we assume, as he clearly does, that Germans wantonly plunged Europe into war in 1939. Assuming this, every wrong suffered by every people who were involved in the subsequent hostilities can be laid to Germany's account. For this alleged crime of September 1939, it is fitting the German people should pay a harsh penalty, and it happens that it is expedient that the Poles should be the sole beneficiaries of the payment of the penalty by Germany. On the other hand, if, as Dr. Taylor maintains, The first shots fired near Danzig in September 1939 were fired through diplomatic blunders on both sides. Then the subsequent course of the conflict appears in a new and totally different light. Seen thus, the German people were only fellow sufferers with the British, French, and Polish peoples, helpless victims of the blundering recklessness of their rulers. Once involved, the view became generally adopted that any act was justifiable if it would help stave off the frightful consequences of defeat. To escape so appalling a calamity, any measure seemed justifiable, even the carrying out of the Lindemann Plan or Hitler's alleged final solution of the Jewish problem. The question of responsibility for the outbreak of the Second World War is therefore a topical question of the most far-reaching practical importance. Indeed, even a prominent German political scientist, Professor Eschenberg of Tübingen, has stated that whoever doubts the exclusive guilt of Germany for the Second World War destroys the foundations for post-war politics. If the orthodox view is expressed in England by Trevor Roper be accepted, the plausible excuse outlined above of Air Marshal Schlesser will be available to extenuate the annexation by Poland of the German territories east of the Oder-Neisse line. On the other hand, if the view of Dr. Taylor wins acceptance, sanctioning this annexation by Poland will appear as a flagrant repudiation of the sacred principle of self-determination, the establishment of which has been generally regarded as the one great blessing conferred on mankind by the First World War. Repudiation of this principle on the simple ground of expediency would only be approved by the British public with greatest reluctance. National self-respect demands some face-saving formula, and the fiction of Germany's sole guilt for the outbreak of war in 1939 provided exactly what was needed. In realization of the importance of the issue at stake, it was decided to invite Dr. Taylor to a public debate of the unwelcome opinions which he had the temerity to express. No doubt, it was believed that if sternly cross-examined on what he had written, he would be compelled to admit that his opinions were contradicted by well-established historical facts. At the very least, the threadbare weakness of his case would be devastatingly exposed to all. As Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford, a post once held by such eminent historians as Bishop William Stubbs and Edward Freeman, Trevor Roper was selected to conduct this expose of his brother historian. It can hardly be said that this televised debate when it took place, threw any extensive light on the disputed question of the origin of the Second World War. The plan adopted was for Robert Key, the chairman, to read out selected passages from Dr. Taylor's book in tones of mingled horror and surprise, and then ask the author whether he could say anything to support such astonishing assertions. Dr. Taylor took these passages in turn, and in a quiet, even voice justified what he had written. He began by taking the wind out completely of his opponent's sails by agreeing that his views would be unquestionably welcomed in Germany. His own views on Germany were all well known, and he had not changed them. I dislike the Germans, he declared. I hope we shall have nothing to do with the Germany either now or in the future. He admitted frankly that when he started to write the book, he expected to come to very different conclusions from those he actually arrived at. But the facts, which he had found in the documents, had forced him, as an honest scholar, to come to his present conclusions. Throughout the discussion, Trevor Roper looked thoroughly uncomfortable. His manner was both defiant and apologetic. Contrasted with Dr. Taylor, he looked extremely youthful. He is, in fact, only 8 years younger, 47. And the general impression given was that of an interview at a public school between a senior mentor, Trevor Roper, called upon to explain some misdemeanor, and a grave and kindly headmaster Taylor. Probably the recollection of the deliberately offensive article which he had written for the July issue of Encounter weighed on Trevor Roper's spirits. It must indeed have been an uncomfortable experience for him to find himself seated at a table face to face with a man against whom he had directed a number of tasteless and baseless jibes. For example, that Dr. Taylor had written his book as a gesture of posthumous defiance to his former master, Sir Louis Nainier, for some imagined slight. It was generally agreed in the British press next day that the honors of the debate had fallen entirely to Dr. Taylor. As one reviewer put it, Dr. Taylor walked away with the argument. He made his points trenchantly, and at times Trevor Roper did not even seem to be able to grasp them fully. Robert Key's presence as chairman was a nuisance. It would have been a better program if he had kept silent. Regarded simply as a means of discrediting Dr. Taylor's views on the origins of the Second World War, apparently the original intention, this televised debate was a complete failure. The only result it achieved, the one least of all desired by its proponents, was to make Dr. Taylor's conclusions known to a vastly wider public than the relatively few who had read his candid, trenchant, and fairly expensive book, or even the readers of the serialization in the Evening Standard. For once, almost the first time since 1939, the iron curtain of discreet silence, which in Great Britain is always carefully draped around unwelcome facts, failed to prevent the truth concerning the origins of the Second World War from reaching the British public. The results may be of incalculable significance. Okay. That's it, everybody. That is the end of the historical blackout. In the chat, we have GF. Early Italian-German relations prior to the war takes you out of the all-fascist alliance, since Mussolini didn't seek German cooperation until later, going against Germany prior to the alliance. Yeah, that was the collapse of the Strasser Front when Britain and France objected to his annexation of Ethiopia, which was in extremely bad taste given how large their empires were at the time. Hashem 1, I think the Treaty of Versailles is blamed for stirring up Germans to the extent that the Germans chose Hitler. Even the famous British economist Keynes said the reparations are impossible to repay. Yes. Record Deepless. The needless bombing is often derided as an alternative to a costly land invasion. The Japanese willingness to surrender is almost never talked about. Yep. GF, you can argue to enslave the planet in order to protect it if the threat is evil enough to take such measures. Yeah. All right, everyone. That's all I have for tonight. That's the end of the blackout. Next week, I'll begin Wars of Rocket by Smedley Butler. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Floyd podcast, signing off.